Let's talk about what's happening deep beneath the streets of McAllen, Texas. There's a story of contamination that's been unfolding for decades, and today we're going to dig into the numbers and see what they really tell us.
So you'd think the first question would be easy, right? How many wells are actually contaminated? Well, it turns out that's not such a simple question to answer. The real number kind of depends on what you mean by active contamination.
So let's break this down. When you look at the latest data from all 80 of the monitoring wells, you can actually come up with 3 totally different answers to that question. Okay, so let's start with the biggest, most inclusive number. If you count any well that shows any sign of active contamination, we're talking either a lab detection or even just visible signs of petroleum, you get 36 wells. That's almost half of them. Now, what if we get a little stricter with our definition? If we only look at the wells where labs confirmed the presence of petroleum compounds, the nasty stuff in gasoline, in the most recent samples, that number drops to 22.
And here is the number you really want to pay attention to: 16. These are the wells where the level of contamination isn't just there, it's officially above the legal safety limits. I mean, these are the ones that are actively failing the test right now.
I mentioned physical signs of petroleum a second ago. That brings us to this kind of technical term, LNAPL. But don't worry, it's pretty simple. Just picture a layer of gasoline that hasn't mixed with the water. It's just floating right on top. And when you see that, you know you've got a serious problem on your hands.
All right, so we've got our 3 different ways to count the problem: 36, 22, and 16. But let's get into the juicy details. Just how bad is it in the worst spots? Let's look at some of the most extreme findings.
Okay, you might want to sit down for this one. The highest level of benzene they found, and remember, benzene is a known carcinogen, was almost 2,000 times over the safety target. No, that is not a typo, 1,988 times the limit. Wow.
And here are the hard numbers to back that up. You can see it right here in the report. The safety target is a tiny 0.05 milligrams per liter. But one well, MWLL, clocked in at 9.94. I mean, that just shows you how incredibly concentrated these hotspots can get.
And it's not just about chemicals dissolved in the water. Remember that LNAPL stuff we just talked about, that floating petroleum? Well, in one of the wells, they measured a layer of it that was 3.3 feet thick. Just try to picture that. A layer of raw fuel over 3 feet deep, just sitting there under the ground. So let's put a few more pieces of the puzzle together. That crazy high benzene level, that was just one well. It turns out there are actually 15 wells that are over the benzene safety target. And that floating fuel, LNAPL, it showed up in 17 different wells. In fact, in 14 of those, the layer was so thick they couldn't even get a proper water sample. Okay, these numbers are pretty wild, but it's easy for them to just be abstract, right? So where is all this actually happening? Let's take a look at a map. All right, so here's the lay of the land. Each of these dots is a monitoring well. The orange ones, those are the 16 wells we talked about that are officially over the safety limits. And the green ones are where they found that LNAPL. So much of it that they couldn't even test the water. And you can see how they're all clustered together, right? That's the plume. And to put a pin in that map, the epicenter of all this is right in a pretty busy part of town, near the intersection of 23rd Street and Business 83. And believe it or not, this is not a new issue, not by a long shot. This contamination was first spotted way back in 1990, and they traced it to some old gas stations. The State Environmental Agency, the TCEQ, didn't actually take over the site until 2009. And since then, they've been the ones monitoring it and trying to clean it up. Okay, so when you hear numbers like 2,000 times the safety limit and find out this has been going on for over 30 years, you'd think alarm bells would be ringing, right? Well, this is where the story takes a really interesting turn. The state's official assessment, it paints a very, very different picture. It's almost like we're looking at 2 different realities at the same time. On one hand, you have the raw data we just saw, major contamination, crazy high benzene levels, feet of floating fuel. But on the other hand, the official word from the TCEQ says that the whole situation is stable and declining. They say they're removing the contaminants, and here's the big one: there's no current risk to the public. And this is a direct quote from their report, which really sums up their position. They're saying that based on everything they've collected, there's no reason to believe anyone in the public is being exposed to this stuff. So, where does all this leave us?
Well, it's pretty clear this story isn't over. Not by a long shot. We have a situation that the state calls stable, but the contamination is obviously still there.
All right, so let's just quickly run through what we know for sure. There's a big plume of contamination under McAllen. We know for a fact that at least 16 wells are over the safety limits right now. But we also know that the state considers the situation stable and says the public isn't in danger, and the cleanup and monitoring are still happening. And all of this really boils down to one final huge question, doesn't it? The plume is stable, but the contamination is still there, some of it at incredibly high levels. So it makes you wonder, what does clean truly mean in a situation like this? It's something to think about, not just for McAllen, but for a lot of places dealing with these kinds of long-term problems.